The December frost had painted the diamond-paned windows of Frosted Window Inn with delicate traceries that gave the establishment its charming name. Within the oak-beamed parlor, the annual street, Nicholas Charity Bazaar, was reaching its festive crescendo, the air thick with the scent of mulled wine and the cheerful babble of Little Wycombe's finest citizens gathered for their most anticipated social event of the season. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner chair near the great stone fireplace, her knitting needles clicking a gentle rhythm as she worked on something soft and white. She had arrived in the village only 3 days prior, accepting the invitation of her dear friend Mrs. Pemberton, whose cottage boasted superior heating but inferior company during the winter months. From her unobtrusive position, Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes missed nothing of the social currents swirling through the warm, lamp-lit room. Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood, the inn's proprietress and undisputed queen of village society, moved through her guests with practiced grace, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her smile never wavering. Yet Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers worried at the pearl brooch on her burgundy dress, and how her gaze repeatedly drifted toward the staircase leading to her private quarters above. At the central table, presiding over the evening's charity auction with ceremonial importance, stood Mr. Alistair Finch, the village solicitor. A precise man with thinning hair and gold spectacles, he had donated the evening's grandest prize, a hamper of imported delicacies from Fortnum and Mason. His pleasure at being the center of attention was evident in his expansive gestures and the way he savored each bid called from the assembled crowd. Dr. Marcus Fleming lounged against the bar, his usually jovial demeanor somewhat strained this evening. The village physician's easy charm seemed forced as he nursed his whiskey, dark circles shadowing his eyes. Miss Marple observed how his gaze followed Mrs. Blackwood with an intensity that spoke of more than professional courtesy. Near the refreshment table, Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, the formidable postmistress, engaged in animated conversation with Colonel Reginald Ainsworth, recently returned from India. Their discussion appeared heated despite their lowered voices, and Miss Marple noted how the colonel's military bearing seemed to stiffen whenever young Timothy Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood's nephew, home from Oxford, passed within earshot. The auction continued with spirited bidding on hand-knitted scarves and homemade preserves. Mr. Finch, clearly relishing his role as auctioneer, raised his glass of Mrs. Blackwood's special mulled wine in a toast to the evening's charitable success. The assembled crowd responded with warm applause and raised glasses of their own. "To the generous hearts of Little Wycombe," Mr. Finch declared, his voice carrying easily across the room. He drained his glass with theatrical flourish, then reached for the ribbon on his donated hamper to begin the evening's final presentation. He never completed the gesture, his face suddenly contorted with surprise, then alarm, as his hand flew to his throat. The empty glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the flagstone floor with a crystalline crash that silenced the cheerful chatter. Finch swayed, clutched at the table's edge, and collapsed with a strangled gasp that echoed through the suddenly still room. Dr. Fleming was beside him in an instant, his professional training overriding social pleasantries. But even from her distant corner, Miss Marple could see from the physician's grave expression that assistance had come too late. "He's gone," Dr. Fleming announced quietly, his words falling like stones into the shocked silence. As the reality of murder settled over the festive gathering like a winter fog, Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting and prepared to observe human nature in its most revealing moments. The stunned silence that followed Dr. Fleming's pronouncement lasted mere heartbeats before shattering into a cacophony of shocked gasps and scraping chairs. Mrs. Blackwood swayed against the refreshment table, her fingers clutching the white cloth as though it were her only anchor to stability. Her pearl brooch trembled with each shallow breath, and Miss Marple noted how the woman's gaze darted repeatedly toward the staircase leading to her private quarters. "Everyone must remain exactly where they are," Dr. Fleming commanded, his social demeanor replaced by clinical authority. He knelt beside Mr. Finch's still form, carefully avoiding the scattered glass fragments while his trained eye assessed what had transpired. "This is clearly a matter for the police." Colonel Ainsworth immediately positioned himself near the inn's entrance, his military bearing evident despite the tremor in his voice. "No one leaves until the authorities arrive," he declared, though his eyes remained fixed on Mrs. Blackwood with an intensity that spoke of more than neighborly concern. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, ever practical despite her obvious distress, bustled toward the telephone in the small reception alcove. "I'll ring Inspector Slack at Melchester," she announced, her postmistress efficiency serving her well in crisis. The urgent murmur of her conversation drifted back as she relayed the shocking news. Miss Marple rose quietly from her corner chair, setting aside her knitting with the sort of unobtrusive grace that made people forget she had moved at all. "Do not distress yourself, child," she said gently to Elsie, the trembling maid who stood frozen near the jam table, her hands sticky with preserves. "Accidents happen at the best of gatherings." Her placid observation allowed the assembled guests to look at one another rather than at the sprawled figure on the floor. It also permitted Miss Marple to step nearer the trestle table, where the spilled mulled wine had created a dark stain across the white cloth. She observed the empty glass beside the hamper, noting the faint smear on its rim, not lipstick, but something with the sheen of sugared peel. A cinnamon stick lay beside Mr. Finch's elbow, while another remained on the table among the scattered raffle tickets. Timothy Blackwood, pale and shaken, moved protectively toward his aunt. "This is monstrous," he said fiercely, his youthful bravado cracking under the weight of witnessing death. Uncle Alistair was perfectly well when he arrived. "The wine," whispered Mrs. Pemberton to Miss Marple. It must have been the mulled wine. Cordelia had prepared his portion specially extra spices, knowing his fondness for cinnamon. Indeed, Miss Marple had observed this detail. While general refreshments had been available to all guests, Mrs. Blackwood had personally served Mr. Finch from a separate silver pitcher, explaining his particular preferences to those nearby. Dr. Fleming rose from his examination, his expression grave. "I suspect poisoning," he announced quietly. "The symptoms are consistent with a rapid-acting toxin, though proper analysis will be required." A collective shudder rippled through the room. Mrs. Blackwood's face drained of remaining color, and she might have fallen had Timothy not steadied her arm. "But who would harm, dear Mr. Finch?" Mrs. Pemberton voiced the question, hanging heavily in the air. "Such a pillar of the community." Miss Marple caught the almost imperceptible glance that passed between Dr. Fleming and Mrs. Blackwood at this innocent observation. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but it spoke volumes about secrets lurking beneath village respectability. The sound of motorcar engines announced Inspector Slack's arrival. As official footsteps echoed on the front steps, Miss Marple quietly resumed her knitting, her needles moving in steady rhythm while her mind catalogued the evening's revelations. In her experience, the moments following a crime often revealed more truth than hours of formal questioning. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent in its responses to shock and fear. Inspector Slack entered the parlor with the measured authority of a man accustomed to village crises, his heavy overcoat dusted with December frost, and his expression bearing the weary skepticism that came from years of untangling human folly. Behind him followed Constable Davies, a younger man whose earnest demeanor and ready notebook suggested he took his duties with utmost seriousness. The inspector's keen eyes swept the assembled guests before settling on the still form of Mr. Finch, then moving methodically to assess the scene. Dr. Fleming, Inspector Slack's gravelly voice, cut through the lingering tension. "What have we here?" The physician stepped forward, his earlier composure intact despite the circumstances. "Alistair Finch, our village solicitor, collapsed approximately 20 minutes past after consuming mulled wine. The symptoms suggest rapid poisoning convulsions, respiratory distress, loss of consciousness within minutes of onset." Inspector Slack nodded curtly and approached the body, his trained gaze immediately fixing on the silver pitcher beside the refreshment table. Miss Marple observed how his attention was drawn to the same details that had caught her own notice: the separate serving vessel, the broken glass, and the faint crystalline residue that sparkled on the cloth. "And who prepared this particular beverage?" the inspector inquired, though his tone suggested he anticipated the answer. Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward with visible effort, Timothy's steadying hand still at her elbow. "I did, Inspector. Mr. Finch had particular preferences, extra cinnamon and a measure of brandy. I prepared his portion separately to accommodate his tastes, as I always do for special guests." "How considerate," Inspector Slack observed with dry inflection. "And who else was aware of these special arrangements?" Mrs. Pemberton interjected helpfully. "Why, everyone present, Inspector." Cordelia made quite a point of mentioning dear Mr. Finch's requirements when she served him. "We all know how particular he could be about his refreshments." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm as she noted the inspector's immediate interest in this detail. However, it was Dr. Fleming who raised the observation that caused the first real stir among the assembled company. "Inspector, the timing strikes me as curious," the physician said thoughtfully. "If the wine was tampered with during initial preparation, why did the effects manifest only now? Finch consumed his first glass nearly an hour ago, and I observed him refill at least twice from the general pitchers." This revelation caused a collective intake of breath. Mrs. Ashworth, her postmistress instincts for detail asserting themselves, nodded vigorously. "Quite correct, Doctor. I watched him throughout the evening. He was most particular about using the same glass, said it brought him fortune at social gatherings, but he certainly partook of multiple servings." Inspector Slack's expression sharpened considerably. "Then perhaps the poison was administered more recently. Constable Davies, secure that glass and pitcher immediately. Who had access to Mr. Finch's final drink?" The question hung heavy in the warm air. Young Timothy spoke hesitantly. "Inspector, I don't believe anyone approached Mr. Finch directly before his collapse. He was standing quite alone at the auction table when he raised his glass for the toast." Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with renewed interest. She had observed Mr. Finch's attachment to his particular glass, noting how he guarded it carefully even when moving about the room. Near the refreshment table, she noticed something that had escaped general attention: a second glass bearing the same faint sugared residue, with a small circle of moisture on the cloth beneath it, as though it had been recently set down and abandoned. As Inspector Slack began directing the collection of evidence, the assembled villagers found their voices returning. The shock was giving way to speculation, and Miss Marple listened carefully to the theories that began to emerge. Mr. Finch's profession made him privy to many secrets. Mrs. Ashworth observed quietly. Property disputes, inheritance matters, family scandals, a solicitor's files contain more village secrets than the parish records. Colonel Ainsworth nodded grimly. The man was forever drafting wills and handling estate matters. One never knew whose financial affairs he might be managing, or whose indiscretions he might have discovered in the course of his duties. Miss Marple noted how these observations caused subtle shifts in the room, a tightening around Dr. Fleming's eyes, the way Mrs. Blackwood's fingers worried at her pearl brooch, Timothy's protective stance near his aunt. Each person seemed to be calculating what secrets Mr. Finch might have possessed about their own affairs. Inspector Slack concluded his preliminary examination and turned to address the gathering. "I'll require detailed statements from each of you. No one leaves the premises until morning. Constable Davies will begin with Mrs. Blackwood, then proceed alphabetically." His gaze swept the room with practiced authority. "And I suggest you all consider very carefully what you observed this evening and what you might prefer to keep private." As the formal investigation began in earnest, Miss Marple quietly resumed her knitting, her sharp mind already cataloguing the evening's revelations, and the fascinating ways that guilt and innocence manifested themselves in the human countenance. The questioning proceeded with methodical precision, Inspector Slack having commandeered the inn's small private dining room for his interviews. Constable Davies carefully wrapped the suspect glasses and silver pitcher, securing them as evidence, while the frost continued to thicken on the diamond-paned windows, sealing the parlor in an atmosphere of mounting tension. Mrs. Blackwood emerged from her interview visibly shaken, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. The pearl brooch on her burgundy dress trembled with each shallow breath, and Timothy immediately moved to her side with protective concern. "The inspector believes the separate picture makes me the obvious suspect," she whispered to Mrs. Pemberton, loud enough for Miss Marple's keen hearing to catch every word. "Because I knew Alistair's preferences so intimately." Dr. Fleming followed shortly after, his professional demeanor intact, but his hands showing a slight tremor as he reached for his whiskey. Miss Marple noted how his reassuring words to Mrs. Blackwood seemed carefully chosen, and how the proprietress's nerves calmed considerably under his attention. While the interrogations continued, Miss Marple made a quiet circuit of the refreshment area, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. Near the auction table, she observed the damp ring that had caught Inspector Slack's earlier attention, perfectly circular, the precise size of a small preserve jar. The light revealed faint crystalline traces scattered on the white cloth, sparkling like tiny diamonds. "Dear child," Miss Marple murmured to Elsie, who was clearing unused cups with trembling hands. "What a trying evening for you." "I only did as I was told, ma'am," Elsie whispered, laid the cups, warmed the spices, fetched the brandy from the pantry. "Finch was particular about his glass, said it brought him luck at gatherings." "How sensible of him," Miss Marple observed gently. "I noticed some lovely candied peel earlier. Such delicate work." Elsie's eyes brightened momentarily. "Mrs. Blackwood prepared it fresh this afternoon, orange and lemon crystals, proper sugared. Mrs. Ashworth said it smelled heavenly and pinched a bit for tasting. There was a small jar by the kitchen range, but later I couldn't find it anywhere." This revelation caused Miss Marple's needles to pause for just a moment before resuming their rhythm. A missing jar of candied peel, and a damp ring precisely where such a container might have rested during the evening's festivities. Colonel Ainsworth was summoned next, his military bearing evident as he strode toward the dining room. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was grim. "Difficult questions about old business," he muttered, settling heavily near the fireplace. "Financial matters better left buried, if you ask me." Mrs. Ashworth's interview followed, and Miss Marple observed how the postmistress emerged, looking thoughtful rather than distressed. Her sharp eyes immediately sought out Timothy, who had been pacing restlessly throughout the proceedings. "The inspector asks pointed questions about correspondence," Mrs. Ashworth said quietly to the group. "Registered letters, business dealings, matters of debt and obligation. Mr. Finch handled many delicate financial arrangements for village residents." Timothy's face paled at this observation, and Miss Marple noted how his youthful confidence seemed to evaporate entirely. When his turn came for questioning, he remained closeted with Inspector Slack longer than any previous interview. Dr. Fleming approached Mrs. Blackwood during Timothy's absence. "Cordelia, you should rest. This ordeal has been exhausting." She shook her head firmly. "Not until Timothy returns. He's been under such strain lately, university expenses, you understand." Miss Marple caught the meaningful glance that passed between the physician and Mrs. Blackwood at this innocent explanation. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but spoke volumes about shared knowledge of Timothy's actual difficulties. When the young man finally emerged, his face was ashen, and his hands shook as he accepted brandy from Dr. Fleming. "The inspector has very specific questions about debts and obligations," he said quietly to his aunt. "Private matters, I thought, were confidential." As the implications settled over the group, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, noting how each revelation shifted the evening's dynamics, while the truth remained tantalizingly hidden beneath layers of village respectability and carefully guarded secrets. Miss Marple's turn for questioning came last, Inspector Slack having apparently deemed her the least significant witness among the assembled company. She settled into the chair across from him with unhurried grace, her knitting bag resting neatly in her lap, while Constable Davies prepared his notebook with earnest efficiency. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" Inspector Slack's tone carried the patronizing patience reserved for elderly ladies who happen to witness unfortunate events. "I understand you're visiting from Street. Mary Mead. What brought you to Little Wickham for the winter season?" "Mrs. Pemberton kindly invited me," Miss Marple replied with gentle courtesy. "Her cottage has superior heating, and I do find these December evenings so much more pleasant with congenial company and charitable activities." The inspector nodded perfunctorily, clearly eager to conclude what he considered a formality. "And this evening's events, what did you observe from your position by the fireplace?" Miss Marple's blue eyes took on a thoughtful expression. "Such a lovely gathering, Inspector. Mrs. Blackwood is clearly devoted to her charitable work, and Mr. Finch seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. He was quite particular about his refreshments. I noticed always returning to the same glass, as though it brought him fortune. Several witnesses mentioned his attachment to that particular tumbler. Did you observe anyone approaching his glass during the evening?" "Oh, Inspector, there was such pleasant mingling throughout the parlor. People moved about, constantly fetching refreshments, examining auction items, engaging in delightful conversation. I did notice a small preserve jar earlier, near the auction table, containing what appeared to be Mrs. Blackwood's lovely candied peel. Such delicate crystallized work requires considerable skill." Inspector Slack leaned forward with sudden interest. "A preserve jar? What happened to it?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Well, these social gatherings create such pleasant chaos. Items are moved about, borrowed, relocated by helpful hands. I'm certain it was simply tidied away, though I did notice a damp ring on the cloth where it might have rested." After concluding her interview, Miss Marple quietly made her way toward the kitchen, ostensibly to assist young Elsie with the washing up. The scullery, warm with gaslight and fragrant with soap and lingering orange essence, revealed its own small mysteries. On the drainboard lay a chipped glass lid, its surface bearing traces of crystallized sugar. "That looks rather lonely without its jar," Miss Marple observed gently. Elsie glanced up nervously. "I found it by the back step, ma'am," as though the jar had been thrown out and broken. There were fresh marks in the frost, and glass fragments scattered about. Before Miss Marple could respond, Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway, his expression sharpening as he noticed the lid. "We'll secure that immediately," he declared, then turned his attention to more pressing matters. Finch's private affairs. The revelation, when it came, cast Timothy Blackwood in an entirely new light. Mr. Finch had been holding substantial debts against the young man's future inheritance, university expenses, gambling obligations, and various extravagances that threatened both his academic career and his aunt's financial stability. The solicitor had recently threatened to call in these loans, a move that would have meant Timothy's immediate ruin and considerable embarrassment for Mrs. Blackwood. "A clear motive," Inspector Slack declared with satisfaction as the assembled guests absorbed this information. "Financial desperation has driven many a young man to desperate measures." Mrs. Blackwood protested vehemently, her pearl brooch trembling with emotion. "Timothy would never harm Mr. Finch. He's impulsive with money, perhaps, but never violent." Dr. Fleming nodded supportively. "The pressure has been immense, but Timothy lacks the calculating nature required for premeditated murder." Miss Marple, however, found herself studying the evening's accumulating evidence with growing interest. The missing preserve jar, the separate pitcher, the timing of the poison's effects, each detail suggested a more complex design than a desperate young man's impulsive act. As suspicion settled heavily upon Timothy, she quietly resumed her knitting, her keen mind already questioning whether the obvious solution was indeed the correct one. The weight of suspicion settling upon Timothy created a palpable tension throughout the parlor, though Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by certain inconsistencies that seemed to escape Inspector Slack's methodical attention. The young man sat hunched near the fireplace, his earlier protective stance toward his aunt replaced by the defeated posture of someone watching his future crumble with each passing moment. Mrs. Blackwood moved to Timothy's side with fierce maternal determination, her pearl brooch trembling with emotion. "Inspector, you must understand my nephew has been under tremendous pressure, but he would never resort to violence. His difficulties with Mr. Finch were financial matters, not personal vendettas. Desperate circumstances drive men to desperate measures," Inspector Slack replied with characteristic curtness. Young Blackwood possessed both compelling motive and clear opportunity. The missing preserve jar suggests deliberate planning rather than impulsive action. Miss Marple, however, approached Mrs. Pemberton with quiet purpose, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm while her sharp mind catalogued the evening's accumulating details. "Such a shocking development," she murmured gently to her hostess. "I couldn't help but recall earlier when Mrs. Ashworth mentioned sampling the candied peel. She remarked how heavenly it smelled and pinched a bit for tasting. Yet she appears entirely well, doesn't she?" Mrs. Pemberton considered this observation thoughtfully. Indeed, Eleanor shows no signs of distress beyond the natural shock of witnessing sudden death. If the preserve contained poison, surely she would be experiencing symptoms by now. This revelation caused Dr. Fleming to approach with professional interest, his medical training immediately grasping the implications. "An astute observation, Miss Marple. Any toxin capable of killing Mr. Finch so rapidly would certainly affect Mrs. Ashworth if she had consumed even small quantities. The compound acted with remarkable speed." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple suggested with characteristic delicacy. "The poison was introduced after Mrs. Ashworth's sampling, but before the preserve jar vanished from the auction table." Inspector Slack, drawn into this discussion despite his initial dismissal of Miss Marple's contributions, found himself reconsidering the evening's timeline. When exactly did Mrs. Ashworth taste this confection? Summoned to clarify, Mrs. Ashworth responded with postmistress precision. "Shortly after the auction commenced, perhaps 40 minutes before poor Mr. Finch's collapse. The jar sat beside his donated hamper, and Cordelia had mentioned preparing fresh crystals that afternoon. They were absolutely delicious." Colonel Ainsworth nodded confirmation. "I witnessed Eleanor's sampling. She complimented the exceptional quality of the orange essence most enthusiastically." This testimony created a significant gap in the poisoning timeline that cast doubt on Timothy's supposed guilt. If the candied peel had been harmless during Mrs. Ashworth's tasting, then someone had contaminated the preserve during the latter portion of the evening, well after Timothy's alleged opportunity during initial preparations. Meanwhile, Miss Marple excused herself for another quiet reconnaissance of the kitchen area. The scullery revealed its own mysteries. A small mortar and pestle bearing traces of white powder, and air that carried faint bitter undertones beneath the lingering orange essence. Someone had been grinding substances in that mortar, something that left acrid residue entirely different from sugar or household spices. More intriguingly, Constable Davies reported finding a folded card in Mr. Finch's waistcoat pocket, an appointment notation for 9:30 in the inn's private blue room upstairs, marked only with the initial C. Mrs. Blackwood's composure shifted noticeably at this revelation, though she maintained her presence in the parlor throughout the evening's fatal toast. Colonel Ainsworth, observing the general scrutiny, cleared his throat with military precision. "Finch scheduled me as well, 10 o'clock, same location. Regarding property documents he claimed required urgent discussion. 2 private appointments for one evening, both in Mrs. Blackwood's establishment, suggested complications far beyond Timothy's financial difficulties." As these revelations accumulated, Miss Marple continued her observations, noting how each new detail shifted the evening's dynamics, while the truth remained tantalizingly concealed beneath layers of village respectability and carefully guarded secrets that ran deeper than anyone yet suspected. The revelation of the appointment cards created immediate urgency, and Inspector Slack wasted no time in leading the group upstairs to examine the blue room. Mrs. Blackwood produced the key with visible reluctance, her pearl brooch trembling as she unlocked the door to her private office space above, the inn's main parlor. The blue room itself appeared ordinary enough mahogany furniture, leather chairs arranged for intimate conversation, and shelves lined with ledgers and correspondence. However, Miss Marple's keen eye immediately noticed the small details that spoke of recent activity. A brandy decanter, with 2 clean snifters arranged on the side table, and beside one glass, a thin sliver of candied orange peel that glittered faintly in the gaslight. "You prepared refreshments for your appointment with Mr. Finch?" Inspector Slack inquired, his tone sharpening with interest. Mrs. Blackwood's composure wavered slightly. "I always make my rooms welcoming for business discussions. Mr. Finch had particular preferences. He enjoyed a touch of orange essence with his brandy during evening consultations." "Yet he never arrived for this appointment?" "No," she replied quietly, her gaze fixed on the empty chairs. "He never came upstairs." Constable Davies's methodical search of the waste paper basket yielded a discovery that caused Dr. Fleming to shift uncomfortably near the doorway. Among the discarded papers lay a torn envelope, its interior dusted with fine crystallization that sparkled like sugar but carried a distinctly bitter, almond-like scent when the inspector examined it cautiously. "Curious," Miss Marple observed gently, approaching the frosted window. "Someone has been watching from this vantage point recently." The frost showed a clear patch where breath or a warm hand had melted the ice, providing an unobstructed view of the inn's back courtyard below. Dr. Fleming cleared his throat with professional authority. "Inspector, I should mention that I accessed the kitchen earlier this evening. Mrs. Pemberton experienced faintness during the festivities, and I required bicarbonate of soda for her relief. Young Elsie provided me with the key to the medicine cupboard." This admission drew sharp attention from the assembled group. Mrs. Pemberton nodded confirmation, though her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "The doctor was most helpful when I felt light-headed. A simple remedy, properly administered." "How long were you in the kitchen area, Doctor?" Inspector Slack pressed. "Perhaps 10 minutes," Dr. Fleming replied carefully. "I prepared the bicarbonate solution and remained with Mrs. Pemberton until her symptoms subsided." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she processed this information. 10 minutes provided ample opportunity for someone with medical knowledge to access the scullery, where Constable Davies had earlier discovered the mortar and pestle bearing traces of white powder and that distinctive bitter scent. The timeline was becoming clearer now. Mrs. Ashworth had safely sampled the candied peel during the auction's early stages, proving the preserve was harmless at that point. The poison had been administered later, during the critical window, when attention focused on the charity bidding and social mingling provided cover for someone to contaminate the orange crystals. "Inspector," Elsie ventured nervously from the doorway. "There's something else about the kitchen key. Dr. Fleming wasn't the only one who asked for it this evening. Mrs. Blackwood requested it earlier as well, saying she needed to check the brandy supply for her private appointments." This revelation caused Mrs. Blackwood's carefully maintained composure to crack visibly. "I merely wanted to ensure adequate refreshments for my business meetings." Mr. Finch was particular about quality, and I thought to verify our supplies. Colonel Ainsworth, who had remained silent during these exchanges, finally spoke with military directness. "This is becoming rather complex, Inspector. Multiple people had access to the kitchen. The preserve jar disappeared and reappeared, and we have 2 separate appointments that may never have occurred. Perhaps we should focus on who actually had both opportunity and compelling motive." Miss Marple found herself studying the evening's accumulating evidence with growing certainty. The bitter envelope suggested someone had prepared the poison in advance, grinding it to powder in the kitchen's mortar. The missing preserve jar provided the perfect delivery method, sweet orange crystals that would mask any bitter taste until too late. Most significantly, the timing required intimate knowledge of Mr. Finch's habits and preferences, suggesting someone who had observed his attachment to that particular glass and his fondness for candied peel. As the group prepared to return downstairs, Miss Marple quietly noted how each revelation had shifted the suspect's reactions. Dr. Fleming's admission about kitchen access, Mrs. Blackwood's defensive explanations about her preparations, and the Colonel's eagerness to redirect attention elsewhere, each response revealed layers of knowledge and concern that went far beyond simple shock at witnessing sudden death. The truth, she reflected, often lay not in what people said, but in what they carefully avoided saying, and tonight's revelations had provided her with several fascinating examples of such careful omissions. As the group descended from the blue room, Inspector Slack carried with him the torn envelope and its bitter residue, evidence that someone had prepared poison with calculated precision. The parlor's atmosphere had grown increasingly strained, the frost on the diamond-paned windows now forming elaborate patterns that seemed to seal the inn from the outside world, creating an intimate stage where secrets could no longer remain hidden. Miss Marple settled into her corner chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, while her sharp mind processed the evening's accumulating revelations. The appointment cards, the missing preserve jar, the bitter envelope, each detail suggested meticulous planning rather than desperate improvisation. Constable Davies emerged from the kitchen carrying a leather folio that had been discovered behind the coal scuttle, its edges smudged with soot as though it had narrowly escaped flames. "Found this tucked away, sir. Appears to be Mr. Finch's private papers." Mrs. Blackwood's breath caught audibly as Inspector Slack opened the folio, revealing neat packets of correspondence and a document bearing an official red seal. "Draft codicil to the will of Harold Blackwood," the inspector read aloud, "recognizing services rendered by Cordelia Blackwood and converting certain life interests to absolute ownership, witnessed by Finch, awaiting final execution." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the assembled company. Mrs. Blackwood closed her eyes, her pearl brooch trembling with each shallow breath. "He brought it this evening to discuss the formalities. Harold's estate has been in trust for years." Colonel Ainsworth's expression darkened considerably. "That document would have made you independently wealthy, Cordelia, far beyond the inn's modest profits. It also explains Mr. Finch's private appointments," Dr. Fleming observed quietly. "Legal matters of such significance require careful witnesses and proper documentation." Miss Marple approached Mrs. Blackwood with characteristic gentleness, her voice carrying innocent curiosity. "My dear, what a complex evening this has been for you. So many preparations, the special mulled wine, the candied peel, the private appointments upstairs. You mentioned checking the brandy supply earlier. But I wonder if you also had occasion to observe the courtyard from your blue room window." Mrs. Blackwood's composure wavered visibly. "I merely wanted to ensure everything was properly arranged for Mr. Finch's visit." "Of course," Miss Marple continued pleasantly. "And that clear patch on the frosted window, such a fine view of the back courtyard. One could observe comings and goings quite easily, perhaps even coordinate timing with remarkable precision." Marple's observations caused Mrs. Blackwood's hands to tremble as she reached for her handkerchief. "Doctor," Fleming moved protectively to her side, his medical training evident in how he assessed her distress. Inspector Slack, sensing the psychological undercurrents, pressed forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, this codicil represents a substantial motive for ensuring Mr. Finch's continued goodwill, yet someone clearly wanted him dead before he could execute these documents. Unless," Miss Marple suggested delicately, "someone feared the codicil's implications might expose other irregularities. Legal documents often require thorough examination of existing arrangements." Timothy, who had remained silent throughout these exchanges, suddenly spoke with desperate urgency. Aunt Cordelia never harmed anyone. She's been nothing but generous with everyone in this village." "Indeed," Colonel Ainsworth agreed, though his tone carried undertones of complexity. "Cordelia's generosity has been extensive over the years." Dr. Fleming's protective stance intensified as he observed Mrs. Blackwood's increasing distress. "She requires rest, Inspector. This ordeal has been exhausting." Miss Marple noted how the physician's concerns seemed to extend beyond professional courtesy, and how Mrs. Blackwood drew comfort from his presence with the familiarity of long association. As the implications of the evening's discoveries settled over the group, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, recognizing that the truth lay not merely in the physical evidence, but in the complex web of relationships and dependencies that bound Little Wycombe's residents together in ways that made murder both unthinkable and inevitable. The long December night wore on, the frost thickening against the diamond-paned windows as Inspector Slack's methodical investigation continued. The forced proximity had created an atmosphere of strained intimacy among the assembled guests, each person acutely aware of the other's movements and expressions. Miss Marple observed how exhaustion was beginning to strip away the social veneer that normally concealed people's true natures. Dr. Fleming had positioned himself protectively near Mrs. Blackwood throughout the evening, a detail that had not escaped Miss Marple's keen attention. Their shared glances carried an intimacy that spoke of more than professional acquaintance, and she noted how Mrs. Blackwood drew comfort from his presence with the familiarity of long association. "Such devoted attention," Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Pemberton, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. "One might almost think Dr. Fleming harbors more than medical concern for Mrs. Blackwood's welfare." Mrs. Pemberton nodded knowingly. "They've been close for years. Ever since Harold Blackwood's passing, the doctor has been wonderfully supportive during Cordelia's difficulties managing the inn alone." This revelation cast the evening's events in an entirely different light, particularly when Constable Davies emerged from his continued search of Mr. Finch's papers, carrying a letter bearing the official seal of the medical board in London. Inspector Slack examined it with growing interest before reading aloud the relevant passages. A formal complaint dated 3 days ago, alleging improper conduct regarding prescription medicines and questioning Dr. Fleming's professional ethics. Mr. Finch writes here of suspicious prescriptions and medicines disappearing from the surgery for purposes unknown. Dr. Fleming's face drained of color, though he maintained his protective stance. Alistair had become increasingly paranoid lately. Seeing conspiracies where none existed, his accusations were entirely unfounded. Colonel Ainsworth cleared his throat with military directness. "Were they, Doctor? There have been whispers in the village about unusual treatments, patients receiving medicines that seemed excessive for their conditions." Miss Marple found herself studying the evening's timeline with renewed fascination. Dr. Fleming possessed medical knowledge of rapid-acting poisons, had accessed the kitchen during the critical period, and was intimately familiar with the inn's layout from frequent visits. Yet something about the sequence of events troubled her analytical mind. "Inspector," she ventured gently, her blue eyes thoughtful, "might we consider the timing more carefully? Dr. Fleming accessed the kitchen early in the evening for Mrs. Pemberton's remedy, yet Mrs. Ashworth safely sampled the candied peel well afterward. If the preserve had been contaminated during his visit, surely she would have experienced symptoms?" This observation caused a moment of uncertainty among the group. Inspector Slack frowned as he processed the implications, while Dr. Fleming's expression shifted from defensive to something approaching relief. "Quite right, Miss Marple," the inspector acknowledged. "The poison was administered later, after Mrs. Ashworth's sampling proved the preserve harmless." Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair, approaching the frosted windows with apparent casualness. "Such intricate patterns the frost creates," she observed pleasantly. "Rather like the patterns of human behavior, wouldn't you say? For instance, That clear patch we noticed earlier on the blue room window, as though someone had pressed their face to the glass, watching the courtyard below. Or perhaps watching the activity in this very parlor. Mrs. Blackwood's pearl brooch trembled visibly as Miss Marple continued her gentle observations. From such a vantage point, one could observe Mr. Finch's habits quite clearly, his attachment to that particular glass, his fondness for returning to the refreshment table, his pleasure in the candied peel. The timing would need to be absolutely precise, wouldn't it? Waiting until after the harmless sampling, then introducing the fatal dose at just the right moment. Dr. Fleming shifted uncomfortably, his medical bag resting at his feet. Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting— "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything definitive, Doctor," Miss Marple replied with characteristic mildness. "Merely observing how human nature reveals itself in moments of crisis. For instance, how someone with medical knowledge might carry certain substances for legitimate purposes, yet find them serving darker ends when circumstances become desperate." Inspector Slack stepped forward with official authority. "Dr. Fleming, I'll need to examine the contents of your medical bag and surgery records immediately." The physician's composure finally cracked as the weight of evidence and suspicion settled upon him. Mrs. Blackwood reached for his hand with desperate affection, her eyes reflecting both fear and a terrible understanding of what his protection had cost them both. Yet Miss Marple continued her knitting with unruffled calm, her keen mind still processing the evening's revelations. Something in the precise timing, the careful preparation, and the intimate knowledge of village relationships suggested that the truth might be even more complex than it appeared. The contents of Dr. Fleming's medical bag lay spread across the sideboard like an accusation, vials of digitalis, morphine preparations, and other compounds that could prove lethal in concentrated doses. Inspector Slack examined each item with methodical precision while the assembled company watched in tense silence, the weight of evidence seeming to settle inevitably upon the village physician. "The complaint to the medical board would have destroyed my practice," Dr. Fleming admitted quietly, his protective stance near Mrs. Blackwood never wavering. 20 years of service to this community, ruined by Finch's vindictive accusations about missing medications and irregular prescriptions. Mrs. Blackwood pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, her pearl brooch trembling with distress. "Marcus, you shouldn't have felt such pressure. I never asked you to." "You didn't need to ask," he interrupted gently, his voice carrying profound regret. "Finch was systematically destroying everyone I cared about. His investigation would have exposed our financial arrangements, Timothy's difficulties, even the medicines I'd provided to help struggling families afford necessary treatments." Inspector Slack nodded with grim satisfaction as the motive crystallized. The physician possessed medical knowledge of poisons, had accessed the kitchen during the critical period, and faced professional ruin from Mr. Finch's accusations. Yet Miss Marple's knitting needles had resumed their gentle rhythm, clicking with unusual intensity, as though keeping time with her racing thoughts. "Such a tragic situation," she murmured, rising from her corner chair with characteristic grace. "Dr. Fleming, you mentioned accessing the kitchen to prepare Mrs. Pemberton's remedy. How very dedicated of you to attend to her distress so promptly." The physician managed a weary smile. "Medical training compels one to respond to suffering immediately, Miss Marple." "Of course," she replied pleasantly, approaching the refreshment table, where evidence of the evening's crime remained scattered. "And during your visit, you would have had opportunity to prepare the fatal dose using that mortar and pestle Constable Davies discovered." Dr. Fleming's shoulders sagged with resignation. "Yes. I ground the compound to powder, then intended to mix it with the candied peel. The orange essence would mask any bitter taste." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily, her blue eyes taking on that particularly sharp quality that Mrs. Pemberton had learned to recognize. "But my dear doctor, there's something that puzzles me about the timing. Ashworth sampled that very preserve well after your kitchen visit, and she suffered no ill effects whatsoever." A stunned silence fell over the parlor as the implications of this observation settled like frost on glass. Dr. Fleming's confession, which had seemed so complete and convincing, suddenly contained a fatal inconsistency. Inspector Slack frowned deeply. "Explain this discrepancy, Doctor. How could Mrs. Ashworth safely consume contaminated preserve if you had poisoned it during your early kitchen access?" Dr. Fleming's face showed genuine bewilderment. I prepared everything correctly. Perhaps the concentration was insufficient, or my nerve failed at the crucial moment. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested with characteristic delicacy, you didn't actually contaminate the preserve at all. Your confession, while touching in its desire to protect those you care about, contains a rather significant impossibility. Mrs. Blackwood looked up sharply, her tear-stained face showing dawning hope mixed with confusion. "Marcus? What is she saying?" The physician's expression shifted from resigned guilt to genuine uncertainty. "I contemplated the deed, prepared the means, but perhaps I couldn't bring myself to complete it." Colonel Ainsworth cleared his throat with military authority. "Inspector, this confession appears to be false. The good doctor may have considered murder, but the actual deed was accomplished by someone else entirely." Miss Marple approached the auction table, where Mr. Finch had collapsed, her keen eyes studying the scattered evidence with renewed purpose. Someone who understood the precise timing required, who observed Mrs. Ashworth's sampling and knew exactly when to strike. Someone who could coordinate the fatal moment with remarkable precision. She paused beside the damp ring on the white cloth, where the mysterious preserve jar had rested. The real murderer was far more clever than we initially imagined, allowing suspicion to fall first on poor Timothy, then on Dr. Fleming, while remaining hidden in plain sight throughout our investigation. As the group absorbed this revelation, Miss Marple quietly examined the crystalline residue that still sparkled in the gaslight. The truth often requires looking beyond the obvious motives to discover the deeper currents of human nature that drive people to desperate acts. And I believe we shall find that this evening's tragedy springs from sources far more complex than professional rivalry or financial desperation. Her gaze swept the assembled company with gentle authority, noting how each face reflected different degrees of relief, confusion, and carefully concealed apprehension. The real murderer remained among them, and Miss Marple's final test was yet to come. Miss Marple's gentle dismissal of Dr. Fleming's confession created a profound shift in the parlor's atmosphere, relief and renewed tension mingling like the frost patterns on the diamond-paned windows. The physician sank into a chair beside Mrs. Blackwood, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had prepared himself for ruin, only to discover his sacrifice was unnecessary. "If I might suggest a very modest experiment," Miss Marple said in a tone as mild as warm milk, her knitting needles tucked safely in her bag, purely to save time and unnecessary distress. She approached Inspector Slack with characteristic deference. One hears so much of scientific methods nowadays, but the simplest observations can be quite revealing. Inspector Slack nodded curtly. "Proceed, Miss Marple." "Your constable secured the glass, Mr. Finch guarded so carefully," she continued pleasantly, "but there was another glass, set aside with the same sugared residue. If we place that second glass in plain view and mention that London's chemists will be able to determine whose hands last touched those crystals, we may save ourselves considerable investigation." Constable Davies retrieved the abandoned glass from the sideboard and set it uncovered on the low table by the hearth. The crystalline residue caught the firelight, glinting with deceptive innocence. Inspector Slack announced with practiced authority, "Our laboratory will have definitive results by morning." The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, as though the matter scarcely concerned her, though her keen eyes missed nothing of the assembled company's reactions. In her experience, the knowledge of impending scientific certainty often revealed more truth than the certainty itself. "Mrs. Blackwood's gaze darted repeatedly toward the glass, her hand moving to her pearl brooch with increasing agitation. She glanced toward the kitchen, toward the staircase. Then back to the evidence that seemed to glow with accusation in the firelight. The timing required for this crime was remarkably precise. Miss Marple observed conversationally. Mrs. Ashworth safely sampled the candied peel during the auction's early stages, proving the preserve was harmless then. Yet Mr. Finch died from consuming what appeared to be identical crystals barely an hour later. She paused meaningfully, allowing the implication to settle. This suggests the murderer substituted different preserve professionally made crystals that would mask bitter tastes more effectively than rough home preparation. Someone with access to expensive materials and intimate knowledge of Mr. Finch's preferences. Mrs. Blackwood rose abruptly, approaching the hearth as though to tidy the evidence. "Perhaps we should cover these things," she murmured, reaching toward the glass. "It upsets people to see." Her fingers stopped just short of the rim, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the involuntary flinch, the protective curling of the forefinger, where a thin strip of plaster hugged the pad. "Dear me," Miss Marple said gently. "Such treacherous little cuts glass lids give, especially when one is disposing of evidence in haste." Mrs. Blackwood's breath caught audibly. "I broke a preserve jar this afternoon. Kitchen accidents happen." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. Though young Elsie mentioned finding the broken jar by the back step during the auction's loudest moments, as though someone had thrown it outside quickly to avoid disturbing the guests. Elsie nodded nervously from the doorway. "That's right, ma'am. During all the bidding commotion, I heard glass breaking outside and found the pieces scattered in the frost." Miss Marple's needles clicked with gentle authority. The appointment card marked C for 9:30. Mrs. Blackwood. "You expected Mr. Finch in your blue room, where you had prepared refreshments including a single sliver of candied orange peel beside the brandy snifter. From that window, you could observe his movements in this parlor, waiting for the perfect moment." The proprietress's carefully maintained composure began to crumble visibly. "Doctor," Fleming moved protectively to her side, his face showing dawning horror and profound sadness. "You served Mr. Finch his special mulled wine personally. You had prepared a single piece of professionally made candied peel, contaminated with the poison Dr. Fleming had left in the scullery. When you served his final glass, you dropped that fatal crystal into it, a seemingly innocent gesture of hospitality." Mrs. Blackwood's hands trembled as she pressed them to her face. "He was going to destroy everything. The inn is failing, Timothy's debts are enormous, and Marcus was only trying to help struggling families afford medicines. But Finch was relentless. He would have exposed our financial arrangements, ruined Marcus's practice, left us all destitute." Inspector Slack stepped forward with official gravity. "Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood, you are under arrest for the murder of Mr. Alistair Finch." She nodded with weary resignation, her pearl brooch trembling one final time. "The codicil would have saved us all, but Finch's investigation would have revealed too much. I couldn't let him destroy the cutter, the people I loved." As the long December night finally drew toward its conclusion, Miss Marple quietly packed away her knitting, reflecting once again on the complex currents of human nature that could transform love and loyalty into instruments of deadly purpose. The frost continued to thicken on the diamond-paned windows, sealing the inn's tragic secret within its walls, while justice prepared to take its inevitable course. The handcuffs closed around Mrs. Blackwood's wrists with quiet finality, the metallic click echoing through the parlor like the closing of a book whose tragic story had reached its inevitable conclusion. Her pearl brooch hung motionless against her burgundy dress, no longer trembling with nervous energy, but still catching the dying firelight with deceptive beauty. Timothy knelt beside her chair, his youthful face etched with bewilderment and grief that spoke of innocence irrevocably lost. Inspector Slack, his professional satisfaction tempered by the evening's human cost, turned to Miss Marple with methodical precision. "For the record, Miss Marple, might you clarify the sequence of events? The court will require a clear understanding of how this crime was accomplished." Miss Marple folded her hands with characteristic grace, her blue eyes reflecting both sadness and the quiet authority that came from understanding human nature's darkest currents. "Certainly, Inspector. Mrs. Ashworth's early sampling of the candied peel proved it harmless at that time. The poison was administered later, requiring someone with intimate knowledge of Mr. Finch's habits and precise timing." She gestured toward the refreshment table, where evidence of the evening's tragedy remained scattered. Mrs. Blackwood had prepared a single contaminated crystal professionally made to mask the bitter taste more effectively than home preparation. The appointment card marked K brought Mr. Finch to expect a private meeting at 9:30. From the blue room window, she observed, and his movements, waiting for the perfect moment during his final toast. Dr. Fleming, who had remained protectively near Mrs. Blackwood throughout the proceedings, closed his eyes with profound regret. "Then my preparation of the poison in the scullery mortar provided the means, though I lacked the resolve to complete the deed myself." "You contemplated the act, but could not bring yourself to execute it. Mrs. Blackwood discovered your preparations and used them for her own desperate purposes. The broken preserve jar, hastily disposed of during the auction's noise, bears witness to her haste. The plaster on her finger reveals where the jagged lid cut her during disposal." Inspector Slack nodded with grim understanding. The timing required extraordinary coordination. "Indeed," Miss Marple continued. "She served Mr. Finch his mulled wine personally, then added what appeared to be an innocent gesture of hospitality. A single piece of candied peel dropped into his cherished glass. The orange essence masked any bitter taste until too late." Mrs. Blackwood spoke quietly from her chair, her voice carrying profound exhaustion. "The codicil would have saved us all, Timothy's debts, the inn's finances, Marcus's ability to help struggling patients, but Mr. Finch's investigation would have exposed everything we'd done to survive. I couldn't watch him destroy the people I loved." As dawn light began filtering through the frosted windows, transforming the diamond patterns into delicate traceries of gold and silver, the assembled company prepared for departure. Timothy would inherit the inn, along with its debts and the burden of his aunt's choices. Dr. Fleming faced professional ruin, but had been spared the greater weight of actual murder. The village of Little Wickham would awaken to news that would forever change its peaceful facade. Miss Marple gathered her knitting as Mrs. Pemberton approached with quiet and understanding. "Such a tragic end to charitable intentions," her hostess murmured. "In my experience, dear," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "murder rarely springs from hatred alone. It grows from promises we feel desperate to keep, from love that becomes so fierce it loses sight of moral boundaries." Mrs. Blackwood's devotion to Timothy and Dr. Fleming was genuine, but it led her to believe that one death could prevent greater suffering. As they walked toward the door, Miss Marple cast one final glance at the parlor, where human nature had revealed its most complex patterns. The auction items remained scattered like remnants of interrupted celebration, their charitable purpose now overshadowed by tragedy's shadow. Outside, the December morning was crisp and clear, frost beginning to melt from surfaces as sunlight touched Little Wickham with promise of eventual renewal. Yet, Miss Marple knew the village would carry this night's revelation forever, the knowledge that beneath its respectable surface lay the same eternal currents of passion, desperation, and moral compromise that made both saints and sinners of ordinary people. "Human nature," she murmured to Mrs. Pemberton as they walked through the quiet streets, creates such intricate patterns in the cold. A little warmth reveals them quite plainly, but the design itself never truly disappears. 3 weeks had passed since that December evening at Frosted Window Inn, and Miss Marple found herself once again settled in Mrs. Pemberton's comfortable parlor, the superior heating providing welcome relief from the January frost that painted new patterns on the cottage windows. The knitting in her lap, a soft white shawl intended for charitable purposes, had grown considerably during the quiet days that followed Little Wickham's tragedy. Mrs. Pemberton entered with the afternoon tea, her expression bearing the subdued quality that had settled over the village like morning mist. "Timothy Blackwood has decided to sell the inn," she reported quietly, settling into her chair with practiced grace. "Poor boy can scarcely bear to remain in Little Wickham after everything that's transpired." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily in their rhythm. "Understandable, though regrettable. The inn has been part of the village's character for generations." "Where will he go?" "Australia," he mentioned. "A fresh start, far from these memories and obligations." Mrs. Pemberton poured tea with the careful attention that grief often brings to simple tasks. "Dr. Fleming has accepted a position in Scotland, a rural practice, where his medical skills will be valued despite the circumstances here." The gentle clink of china provided peaceful counterpoint to their conversation, though Miss Marple noted how her hostess's hands trembled slightly when discussing recent events. The shock of discovering murder among familiar faces had affected everyone in Little Wickham, creating an atmosphere of careful politeness that replaced the easy intimacy of village life. "And Mrs. Blackwood?" Miss Marple inquired with characteristic delicacy. Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew more subdued. "The trial is scheduled for spring. Her solicitor believes the circumstances, desperation, protection of loved ones, her previous exemplary character may result in manslaughter rather than murder charges. The judge will consider how financial pressures and genuine devotion drove her to such desperate measures." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the steady rhythm providing comfort in its familiarity. Human nature contains such contradictions, doesn't it? The same devotion that makes someone a pillar of community respectability can drive them to unthinkable acts when those they love are threatened. Through the cottage window, she could observe the village's daily routine continuing with determined normalcy. Mrs. Ashworth still managed the post office with efficient authority, though her earlier enthusiasm for social gatherings had noticeably dimmed. Colonel Ainsworth maintained his military bearing during morning walks, yet avoided the path that led past the inn's now shuttered windows. The preserve jar was the key detail, Miss Marple mused aloud, her blue eyes thoughtful. Such a small thing, yet it revealed the careful planning behind what appeared to be desperate impulse. Mrs. Blackwood's expertise with candied peel allowed her to create the perfect delivery method, sweet enough to mask bitter poison, special enough to seem like innocent hospitality. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the comfortable parlor. Miss Marple reflected on how Mr. Finch, in his own rigid way, had believed he was simply performing his professional duty. Yet rules applied without understanding human complexity could sometimes precipitate the very tragedies they were meant to prevent. "I shall return to Street Mary Mead tomorrow," she announced quietly. "Your hospitality has been wonderful, but I find myself longing for familiar surroundings after such disturbing revelations." Mrs. Pemberton nodded with understanding. "Of course, Jane. Though I shall miss your company terribly, your presence during this difficult time has been more comforting than you can imagine." As evening settled over Little Wickham, Miss Marple completed another row of her charitable knitting, finding solace in productive rhythm that had accompanied her through decades of observing human nature's complex patterns. The white shawl would eventually bring comfort to someone in need, a small gesture of kindness, standing in stark contrast to the tragedy they had witnessed. The frost began forming new patterns on the cottage windows, delicate traceries that would disappear with morning's warmth, but whose essential design remained constant through endless repetition. Rather like human nature itself, Miss Marple thought peacefully. The circumstances changed, but underlying patterns of love, fear, desperation, and moral compromise remained as predictable as winter frost, and as revealing as clear glass when examined with sufficient patience and understanding.